John Paul Jones had single-handedly brought the American Revolution home to the British Isles. In Britain, he was known as a pirate and a scoundrel, but in America, he'll be known as the father of the U.S. Navy. In America, Congress loved Jones's plan to attack the British Isles by sea as pure lunacy. The British were the undisputed champions of the sea, while the Americans did not even possess any true war vessels. However, Jones believed that bringing the war to the British homeland was the only way to shake the people's resolve and convince them to end the revolution. To that end, Jones had a great deal of success. In 1779, he led numerous raids against British coastal towns. Starting in August, he led a campaign around the Isles to seize British warships. He had much success, capturing 16 ships in total. The British were outraged and disbelief that this pirate had been achieving such success against them. They demanded that the British Navy intervene with all haste. On September 23rd, the British received their opportunity to defeat Jones once and for all. The British, sailing a brand new state-of-the-art warship, met the American fleet at Flamborough Head, and the two fleets would enter battle. This is Grim Battaglia, and you're watching my series on battles of the American Revolution. This is Father of the U.S. Navy and the Battle of Flamsborough Head. On September 23rd, at around 6 a.m., the American fleet was sailing along the dark British eastern coast. They had been raiding local towns and attacking shipping routes. Their fleet comprised of 4 ships: the Alliance, the Richard, the Pallas, and the Vengeance. Jones led the fleet from aboard the Richard. He had his ships raise the British colors to full enemy vessels, a clear violation of international naval law. It was this, combined with his raids on non-military targets, that caused him to be branded a pirate. Along the coast, a castle raised a red flag as a warning to all that pirates were nearby. Commanded from aboard the Seppris by Sir Richard Pearson, the British moved towards the American position. The British ships were guarding a merchant convoy that was returning from the Baltic. Seeing that they were close to home, some of these ships had broken formation, and they sailed dangerously close to the American ships. When Pearson recognized the danger, he ordered his ship to fire 2 warning shots as a signal for them to rejoin the convoy. Hearing the shots, British citizens began to line the coast. They brought weapons to prepare for a potential American landing, but mostly, they'd arrived to watch the spectacle of the 2 navies illuminating the night sky with their naval battle. The Richard was a merchant vessel, which had been repurposed into a medium-sized frigate and gifted to the Americans by France. The Richard had 18 12-pounder cannons and 8 newly equipped powerful 18-pounder cannons. It had a total crew size of around 320 men. A French naval officer commanded the Alliance, which was equipped similarly to the Richard. The Pallas and the Vengeance were both 2 lesser-sized frigates. The HMS Seppris was a new state-of-the-art British warship. Its hull was coated in copper, which made it far more maneuverable than its American counterparts. It had 10 powerful 18-pounder cannons on each side, and they were all placed low down near the waterline, so that they could pierce the enemy hull directly upon being fired. It had a crew size of approximately 320 men. It was accompanied by the Duchess of Scarborough, which was a smaller ship, made up of merchants for hire, paid to protect the convoy. Some of the British merchant ships broke formation and tried to flee towards a local port town. Pearson ordered his ships to move into a defensive position and protect the rest of the convoy. Aboard the Richard, Jones signaled for his men to enter a single-line battle formation. He hoped this would confuse the enemy as to the size of his fleet. The commander aboard the Alliance disobeyed orders and instead moved his ship to pursue the fleeing merchant vessels. Richard continued to sail its British flag as it sailed ever closer towards the Seppris. Captain Pearson, not wanting to fire upon a friendly vessel, yelled out to the Richard, "Identify yourselves!" His voice carried across the calm, nighttime sea. Not wanting his accent to undo his ruse prematurely, Richard had a British native respond, "We are the Princess Royale." The British responded, "Where are you from?" Aboard the Richard, there was silence as the ship sailed ever closer towards the Seppris, closing the firing gap. Pearson yelled out, "Answer immediately, or I shall be forced to fire upon you." Jones decided that the time for battle had come. He raised the American flag and cried out, "Answer them with a broadside!" With that, the Richard opened fire upon Pearson, illuminating the night sky. The Separatists answered immediately with a broadside of her own, and thus the battle was underway. The battle continued through the morning as the Richard and the Separatists engaged in a one-on-one duel. The Scarborough had sailed off to protect the merchant convoy, with the Alliance in hot pursuit. The Vengeance and the Palace would have been able to aid the ships in maintaining proper formation, but as it was, intervening in a one-on-one duel was too dangerous. If they engaged, they were just as likely to fire upon the Richard as they were the Separatists, or worse, they could be hit by the Richard's cannons. The duel was not going well for the Richard. When she went to fire her powerful 18-pounders, 3 of them had exploded, badly damaging the ship, killing many and spreading fires throughout her. The rest of her 18-pounder guns were abandoned out of fear. All the while, the Separatists continued to fire broadsides upon her with her powerful 18-pounders. The Richard was taking on water, and her men were desperately working the pumps to try and keep the ship maneuverable. Seeing that the Richard was not faring well, Jones decided that naval boarding was the only way to achieve victory. He attempted to close the gap between the ships so that his men could attach their grappling hooks and bind the 2 ships together. However, with her copper hulls, the Separatist was able to easily outmaneuver the Richard. She was able to remain slightly ahead of her and fire broadsides upon the Richard as he desperately gave hot pursuit. As the duel continued into the afternoon, the Richard at one point collided with the Separatist in the rear. Captain Pearson mockingly yelled out, "Has your ship struck?" To strike a flag was to surrender in naval combat. Jones reportedly replied back, "I have not yet begun to fight." However, the situation for Jones was bleak. His ship was badly damaged, taking on water and decisively losing the engagement. At this point, the ship only had 3 operational cannons remaining. Meanwhile, the Alliance decided to retreat from the Scarborough after receiving only a single broadside. The Alliance sailed towards the Palace and the Vengeance. Like the American ships, the Scarborough determined that it would be too dangerous to intervene in the duel between Jones and Pearson. He instead sailed towards them, feigning an attack, hoping to draw the rest of the American fleet away from the battle. The Palace took the bait and gave chase. The Richard then had a stroke of luck. During their engagement, the sails from the Separatists were damaged and leaned towards the side. They became intertwined with the Richard, locking the 2 ships together. Being an experienced captain, Pearson had a plan. Both ships were still using their sails. He would drop his anchor, causing the Separatists to stop abruptly, while the Richard would be pushed forward by the wind, untangling the sails and separating the 2 ships. But the crew of the Richard were experienced as well. They used this opportunity to lean into the Separatists and force the 2 ships into a wide spin, further locking them together. Sensing his moment had come, Jones gave the order. His ship tossed out its grappling hooks, tying the 2 vessels together and pulling the Separatists close to the Richard so the boarding could commence. Jones also caught a stroke of luck when the Separatists' spare anchor became locked inside of her ship. Before the boarding could begin, Jones needed to clear the enemy decks. He had placed marksmen and sailors in the ship's masts and armed them with small arms. They began firing upon the Separatists' men. Jones commanded the entire battle from aboard of his ship. Sir Pearson, however, had retreated below deck for his own safety. Jones had 3 remaining cannons placed on the deck and turned to fire upon the Separatists. He had loaded the 2 cannons with canister shot, which was essentially a cannon-sized shotgun round, and fired upon the Separatists at close range. He had loaded the remaining gun with solid shot and aimed to take down the Separatists' main mast, preventing her from escaping. The battle continued into the evening with neither side giving way. The Richard continued firing her cannons at the crew aboard the Separatists' deck, killing a great many. The Separatists was responding by firing full broadsides into the Richard's hull at extremely close range. The Richard was so badly damaged that many of the shots were passing right through her. The Alliance then entered the battle, seeking to assist. She fired a broadside into the front of the Separatists, but at such close range, the broadside passed through her, devastating both ships. The Alliance then sailed off to join the Palace in the fight against the Scarborough. The battle approached 9 p.m., now having raged for well over 10 hours. Both sides continuously moved men onto the decks to keep defending their ships. At this point, the Richard was definitively losing the battle. Many of her crew were dead, the ship was badly damaged, and most of her cannons were not operational, and all the while the ship was taking on ever more water. But now they had a stroke of luck. A sailor from the Richard threw a grenade towards the Seppars. The grenade found an open hatch and fell almost 2 levels down into the ship. It exploded upon a gunpowder cache and set off a chain reaction of explosions throughout the ship. Many British sailors died, and the fires began to rage aboard the ship. Several men from the Seppars jumped into the water to prevent themselves from being burned alive. Still, the Seppars continued to give battle. Aboard the Richard, Jones was covered in soot and gunpowder. He walked towards a coop, leaned on it, and fell down. Many aboard the Richard believed that he had died. A first mate took command, gathered other crew members, and they decided that they must strike their flag and surrender. But the American flag was too badly damaged from the battle to be stricken. The sailors called out to the Seppars saying they wished to strike. Struggling to hear over the battle, the British responded, "Do you mean to strike?" When the American officer went to respond, Jones, appearing very much alive, approached him and struck him in the back of the head with his pistol, knocking him unconscious. He yelled out in response, "I may sink, but I will never strike." Meanwhile, the Alliance had fired a close-range broadside into the Scarborough and forced her into surrendering the ship. She then turned and began to make her way back towards the Richard to lend her aid. The Alliance re-entered the battle and fired a full broadside into the Seppars. Again, many of her shots passed out directly through the Seppars and damaged the Richard extremely badly. From aboard the Richard, Jones cried out, "Stop firing! Stop firing! Assist in the boarding immediately!" and he raised a signal to the Alliance. However, the Alliance disregarded this command and sailed away, seeking to return and make another broadside. Pearson had not actually heard Jones' reply when he asked if he intended to strike. He decided to send a boarding party aboard the Richard to find out. The sailors landed aboard the Richard, and the crew gave battle. Jones had been waiting for this. A group of sailors who had been hiding suddenly appeared and overwhelmed the British boarding party. At this point, the Richard was barely afloat. The ship was listing badly and taking on more water than the pumps could handle. The broadsides from the Alliance had devastated her. Despite this, Jones saw that the Seppars was badly damaged as well and refused to strike, continuing to give battle. Aboard the Richard, a merciful quartermaster decided to free around 100 British prisoners who had been locked in the lower decks of the ship. They flooded the main deck, creating a panic for Jones, who believed that they would aid the British in battle. Jones, thinking fast, told the men that they needed to man the pumps or they would all drown. The prisoners complied and raced below deck to begin pumping water out of the ship. Just then the Alliance came around again, seeking, against Jones' orders, to fire another broadside. Unaware of how bad the situation aboard the Richard was, Pearson decided that he must surrender. The Seppars was badly damaged, many were dead or injured, and now the undamaged Alliance was seeking to circle her and fire continuous broadsides into her. He struck his flag and officially surrendered the battle. After the battle, Jones proved he was a man of his word when he had stated that he would rather sink than strike. The Richard took on more water than it could sustain, and Jones was forced to transfer all of his crew to the Seppars, while the Richard disappeared below the waves. The American fleet then sailed back to mainland Europe with its 2 newly captured vessels and began planning when to resume their attack. Jones's victory was not significant in and of itself. Capturing 2 British warships was not going to bring the Empire to its knees. However, his repeated attacks and his harassment of their coasts did put economic strain on the country. The price of insurance for shipping skyrocketed, and with it, the price of importing goods. The British were also forced to send out protection ships to guide incoming merchant vessels, which further strained their economy. It was economic strife that caused the British to tax the 13 colonies, and it was those taxes that sparked the Revolutionary War. Jones's effort further exacerbated that strife. Perhaps more importantly, Jones caused the war to begin to feel more real to the average British citizen. They now had to worry about being attacked from the sea within their own homes, and they felt the effects of his raids on their wallets across the island. The war was no longer an abstract foreign concept. It had come directly to British shores. For Jones's bravery, his cunning, and his refusal to admit defeat, even when all odds were stacked against him, he's remembered as the father of the U.S. Navy. Join us next week to see if Washington is able to protect the American capital from falling to British hands. This was Grim Battaglia, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe. Thank you for watching, and as always, I hope you enjoyed the video and never stop learning.